world of training is full of controversies. Well, I would call them minor disagreements, really. And one of the most common of these myths or discussion point is whether you should use your carbs, carbohydrates, before your workout or after. Now, the reason for this discrepancy is that at first, when we started to use carbs and protein to increase the response and recovery from our training, we would have them post-workout. And that was the strategy used for many years. Basically, it comes from scientific research done on endurance athletes simply studying the rate of glycogen replenishment after a session. Basically, they wanted to see if consuming carbs right after a session led to an increase in the recovery of the glycogen stores. Obviously, it did. And then it was extrapolated that this was also a way to increase the recovery from weight training session. And it works. Consuming carbs and protein amino acid post-workout has been shown to be really effective at increasing both the gains from your session as well as your recovery. Now, over the past few years, the trend has been toward consuming those carbohydrates and protein before the sessions. I think that this was really started with the great Milo Sarcev, bodybuilding legend, of course, who was probably, to the best of my knowledge anyway, the first one to really push hard the use of carbohydrates and amino acids pre and during the workout. Obviously, nowadays, you have many other great bodybuilders like John Meadows using that exact same strategy. I've been using that myself for many years also. Now, there are still some arguments between the people who are still preferring to use the carbs post-workout and those who now are pushing toward the pre-workout solution. And I'm going to give you my opinion on which is the best approach and why. Well, first, the argument for not consuming the carbs pre-workout is that it would decrease the catecholamine response to training. Now, the catecholamines are substances, hormones, that increases heart rate, but mostly increase the mobilization of stored energy, along with cortisol. So when you are training, you will increase catecholamines and you will increase cortisol. Now, the role of these two hormones is to make energy available while you're training so you can fuel muscle contraction. That's really important to understand. It is not the release of these hormones that is key. It is the fact that they will allow you to mobilize energy. So the increase in catecholamine and cortisol is not a goal in itself. It's just a mean to achieve the goal. That will be very clear and important later on. Now, the second argument is, so the first argument is that if you consume carbs prior to your session, the release of catecholamines and cortisol is lower, which is actually true. It's been measured in studies. If I'm consuming carbs, I will release less cortisol and less catecholamines. But when you think about it, is that such a bad thing? Because what we want is just to have energy available. That's why catecholamines and cortisol are released during training, to make energy available. But if I'm consuming carbs pre-workout, the energy is readily available for me. I do not need to go in my reserves of muscle glycogen and burn that for fuel. That's why cortisol and catecholamines are not increased as much. Not because the carbs, for some reason, put your body in a bad situation. To the contrary, they put the body in a positive situation, the situation it doesn't need to mobilize its reserves. Now, the counter-argument to that, well, if I'm giving fuel to my body prior to training, I won't need to mobilize the fat stored as much either, so I will lose less fat. Well, maybe, but my opinion is that fat loss is maximized through the diet for over 24 hours, energy systems work. Whereas the lifting session itself is there for one purpose and one purpose only, to help you build muscle or maintain muscle when you are in a caloric deficit. So that's the first thing. Second thing, when you're dieting down, your goal is to lose fat, right? Well, you probably have elevated cortisol level throughout the day. It's normal because the role of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy. So if I'm consuming a fat loss diet, which has a deficit in calories, then I need to mobilize more energy. So my cortisol go up. Now, the thing is that cortisol is really, really bad for muscle mass. It can actually stop the muscle building process. It can increase protein breakdown, breaking down the muscle tissue for energy, so losing muscle mass just for fuel. And it also can increase the expression of the myostatin gene. The more cortisol I have, the higher my myostatin gene is, which means that I will not be able to add a lot of muscle. So you don't want elevated cortisol throughout the day. When you're dieting down, chances are that it is already pretty elevated. So the last thing you want is to jack it up even higher when you're training. So in that sense, in my opinion, consuming carbs prior to the session will actually help you lose more fat when you're on a fat loss diet, as well as build more muscle mass if your goal is to gain muscle. Now, the reason that is that when I'm training, let's say you're a natural trainee, right? Well, cortisol is your worst enemy. When you're a natural athlete, not using performance-enhancing drugs, you have to use the actual training session to trigger protein synthesis. Now, protein synthesis has to be as high as possible, whereas protein breakdown should be as low as possible. That is why you're building muscle. So when I'm training, I want to increase something called mTOR as much as possible. mTOR is the light switch. Protein synthesis is the light. So the more I turn on mTOR, the more protein synthesis I get. It has been shown that both insulin and actually carbohydrates intake increases mTOR activation. So when you're training, if you're consuming carbs before you train, you will get a higher mTOR release, meaning that the same amount of work will trigger more protein synthesis, building more muscle. That's the first way it helps. The second way it helps, carbohydrate depletion, or having to use carbohydrates for fuel, right, increases the release of the enzyme called AMPK. And AMPK, which is released when I have to mobilize a lot of stored energy. AMPK inhibits mTOR. It turns it off. It turns the light switch off. So the more of my stored energy I have to use, instead of what is readily available in my bloodstream, the more I have to use that is stored, the more AMPK I get, the more I turn off protein synthesis. So by using my stored glycogen, I'm actually reducing the amount of muscle mass I will build from the session. So if I'm consuming carbs pre-workout or even during workout, I have energy already available. I do not need to mobilize my reserves. If I don't need to mobilize my reserves, then I don't increase AMPK as much, and the result is higher protein synthesis, less protein breakdown. So the outcome is building more muscle. So that's the two main reasons why consuming carbs pre-workout helps build more muscle. The third one is that it decreases cortisol level, right? Why? Because cortisol increases during a workout to mobilize energy. But if I already have carbs in my body, I don't need to mobilize my storage. So that leads to a lower cortisol level, which helps me keep my testosterone higher and also increase protein synthesis. So the end result is definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, consuming carbs pre-workout will lead to a greater amount of protein synthesis and muscle growth than having those carbs post-workout. Because if you're having them post-workout, all you're doing basically is replenishing what you use during the session. Whereas if you have them before, you are preventing the depletion of the reserve beforehand, and you're getting a hormonal response that will make the workout more effective at stimulating growth. So definitely, in my opinion, it's not even an argument, carbs should be consumed before the session.